There's a strange moment that most people never notice. It happens quietly. You say something to yourself, almost automatically, and your body reacts before you have time to think. Your shoulders tense, your breath shifts, your mood darkens or lifts instantly, and then you move on. No warning, no explanation, just a subtle internal change that feels normal. But what if it isn't? What if every sentence you repeat, especially the ones you don't question, is quietly shaping the way you experience reality? From the moment you learned to speak, you entered into an invisible contract. You agreed, without being asked, to describe the world using a set of words that were already loaded with meaning, emotion, and expectation. You inherited phrases, judgments, definitions, limits, and over time, those words didn't just explain reality, they began to replace it. You were taught that language is a tool, something practical, neutral, harmless, but that idea collapses the moment you notice how deeply words affect you. A single sentence can ruin your entire day. Another can give you courage you didn't know you had. If words were merely symbols, this wouldn't happen. So why does it? Because language doesn't just pass through the mind. It lands. Every word you hear or speak leaves a trace. It creates an internal posture, a subtle expectation, a frame through which everything else is filtered. You don't see the world directly. You see it through narration, and most of that narration isn't chosen. Think about how often you speak without intention. I'm tired. I always mess this up. This is just how life is. I'm not that kind of person. They sound harmless, even honest, but honesty is not the same as truth. When repeated, these phrases become instructions, not to the universe, but to you. Your mind listens, your nervous system adjusts, your behavior follows, not because the words are true, but because they are familiar. Ancient cultures understood this far better than we do. They treated words with caution, with restraint, with reverence. Names were not casual labels, they were forces. To name something was to define how it could exist. That's why silence mattered. Silence was not emptiness. It was potential. Speaking was considered an act of creation, not expression. Some words were whispered, some were restricted, some were never spoken at all. Not because people were superstitious, but because they were observant. They noticed something we forgot, that the mind does not argue with repetition. It absorbs it. Your subconscious does not evaluate statements for accuracy. It evaluates them for frequency. What you repeat becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes safe. What feels safe becomes identity. And once something becomes identity, it stops being questioned. This is how invisible prisons are built. Not with force, but with language. You don't wake up one day trapped. You wake up one day convinced that the walls are just how things are. Most people don't suffer because of what happens to them. They suffer because of the story they tell themselves about it. The story gives meaning. The meaning shapes emotion. The emotion dictates action, and the cycle repeats. You fail once, and the event passes, but the sentence remains. I'm not good at this. Now the failure has a future. Words do something else that's even more dangerous. They collapse complexity. Reality is fluid, uncertain, layered. Language freezes it. When you say, I am anxious, you turn a passing state into a permanent label. When you say, I am weak, you turn a moment of exhaustion into an identity. The mind prefers fixed categories because they reduce effort. But safety through simplification comes at a cost. You stop evolving. You stop exploring alternative interpretations. You stop noticing exceptions. And eventually, you stop noticing yourself. This is why inner dialogue matters more than outer speech. The world hears what you say occasionally. You hear yourself constantly. That quiet voice running in the background of your life is the most powerful narrator you will ever encounter, and most people never question where it came from. Is it really your voice? Or is it an echo, borrowed from parents, teachers, authority, past failures, cultural expectations? You didn't choose most of your internal language. You inherited it, and inheritance is only powerful until it's examined. Here's the unsettling truth. You are not responding to reality. You are responding to descriptions of reality. Descriptions that can be changed, but only if you notice them. This is where awareness begins. Not with affirmation, not with positivity, but with listening. Listening to how you speak when no one is around. Listening to the phrases you repeat when you're tired, stressed, or afraid. Listening without judgment. Because the goal is not to silence your voice. The goal is to reclaim authorship. In the next session, we'll explore how repetition turns words into mental architecture, and how certain phrases quietly lock you into emotional patterns you didn't consciously choose. But for now, sit with this. If words truly had no power, they wouldn't be able to shape how you feel without your permission. And yet, they do. Which means the power was never in the words themselves. It was in the agreement you made with them. An agreement you can revisit. If this made you pause, even for a moment, support the journey by liking the video. Most people believe that a thought becomes powerful when it is emotional. That isn't true. A thought becomes powerful when it is repeated. Emotion gives a thought intensity, yes, but repetition gives it authority. This is how habits form. This is how beliefs harden. This is how identities are constructed without ever being consciously chosen. The mind is not designed to search endlessly for truth. It is designed to conserve energy, and repetition is the mind's shortcut. When a sentence is repeated often enough, the mind stops checking whether it is accurate and starts treating it as background reality, like gravity, like time, like something that simply is. This is why your earliest beliefs feel the strongest, not because they were correct, but because they were installed before you had the tools to question them. Repetition builds familiarity. Familiarity builds trust. Trust builds obedience. This is not philosophy. This is how conditioning works. Think about how you learned language in the first place. No one explained grammar to you in the beginning. No one justified meanings. You heard words again and again in specific emotional contexts, and your mind connected them automatically. Tone, expression, outcome. The word wasn't just learned, it was felt. And once a word is tied to a feeling, it stops being neutral. It becomes a trigger. This is why certain phrases create instant reactions in you, even when you logically disagree with them. Your body reacts faster than your intellect, because the body remembers patterns long before the mind forms arguments. Now, apply this to your inner dialogue. Most of what you say to yourself is not dramatic or intense. It's casual, offhand, almost invisible. And that's exactly why it works. I guess I'm just not disciplined. This always happens to me. I'll start later. That's just who I am. None of these sound destructive on their own, but repeated daily, they form a structure that quietly defines what you attempt, what you avoid, and what you assume is possible. Repetition doesn't shout, it whispers, and whispers are more dangerous because they bypass resistance. The mind fights loud threats. It surrenders to quiet ones. This is how people end up living lives they never consciously chose, not because of trauma alone, not because of bad luck, but because of sentences that became familiar enough to feel true. At some point, repetition crosses a threshold. A thought stops being an idea and becomes an assumption. And assumptions are invisible. You don't argue with them. You don't analyze them. You act from them. This is where language becomes architecture. Every repeated phrase is like a brick. Some bricks build stability, others build walls. And most people never notice what they're constructing until they feel trapped inside it. Here's the paradox. The same mechanism that creates limitation is also the mechanism that creates freedom. Repetition is neutral. It does not care what it installs, which means the cage and the key are built from the same material. The difference is intention. Most people repeat words unconsciously. They rehearse the same internal script every day, reinforcing patterns. They claim to want to escape. They say they want change, but repeat the language of permanence. They say they want confidence, but rehearse the language of doubt. The mind listens to behavior, not desire. And speech is behavior, especially internal speech. Now, this is where many people misunderstand change. They try to replace old language with forced positivity. They jump from "I am worthless" to "I am unstoppable." The mind rejects this immediately, not because positivity is false, but because it doesn't match the existing structure. Beliefs don't change through contradiction. They change through gradual repatterning. Think of repetition as erosion. Water doesn't destroy rock with force. It reshapes it with persistence. The most effective language shifts are subtle. They don't shock the system. They redirect it. Instead of, "I always fail," "I'm learning how this works." Instead of, "I'm weak," "I'm rebuilding strength." Instead of, "This is impossible. I don't see the path yet." These aren't affirmations. They are permission slips. They keep the mind open instead of defensive. And openness is where transformation begins. But repetition alone is not enough. There is a second element that determines whether words become empty noise or internal commands. Alignment. If your words and your internal state are in conflict, repetition creates friction instead of change. You can repeat a sentence 1,000 times, but if your body tightens every time you say it, the mind receives mixed signals. The body always votes first. That's why tone matters. Pacing matters. Silence matters. Sometimes a single slowly spoken sentence with attention is more powerful than 100 rushed ones. The ancients understood rhythm intuitively. They didn't rush language. They allowed words to land. Because when a word is fully felt, it doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be true enough to be repeated. This is why awareness must come before reprogramming. If you don't first notice what you're already repeating, you'll simply stack new language on top of old foundations, and cracks will appear. So the real work begins with observation. For one day, notice, what do you say when you wake up? What do you say when something goes wrong? What do you say when no one is listening? Not to judge it, not to fix it, just to hear it. Because once language is conscious, it loses its grip. Unconscious repetition controls you. Conscious repetition becomes a tool, and tools can be learned. In the final session, we'll bring this understanding into practice, how to consciously choose words that align your internal state instead of fighting it, and how to turn everyday speech into a quiet form of self-mastery. But for now, remember this. Your life is shaped less by what happens to you and more by what you rehearse internally after it happens. And repetition is rehearsal. If you're ready to continue this journey, subscribe to the channel. There is a moment when understanding stops being enough. You can see the pattern, you can name the mechanism, you can even explain why things unfold the way they do. And still, nothing changes. This is where most people get stuck, not because they lack insight, but because insight without integration becomes another story the mind tells itself. Real change does not arrive dramatically. It arrives quietly through alignment. Alignment means that what you say, what you feel, and what you repeat are no longer in conflict. When they are misaligned, life feels noisy, fragmented, exhausting. When they align, things feel simpler. Not easier, but clearer. This is the point where language stops being theory and becomes practice. And the practice is subtle. It doesn't begin with big declarations. It begins with restraint. Most people think power comes from speaking more, but power often begins with speaking less, with interrupting the automatic sentence before it finishes itself, with noticing the moment you're about to repeat an old phrase and choosing not to. That pause is not empty. It's the space where authorship returns, because the most important words are not the ones you speak out loud. They are the ones you almost say. The mind is constantly narrating, but you don't have to accept every line of dialogue. You are allowed to edit. This is where alignment starts. Not by forcing new language, but by withdrawing energy from language that no longer serves you. Silence is not passive. Silence is selection. When you stop reinforcing a phrase, it begins to weaken. Not immediately, but inevitably. Repetition gives words strength. Absence removes it. Now, here's where the shift becomes practical. Instead of asking, "What should I say to change my life?" ask, "What do I keep saying that keeps my life the same?" That question reveals more than any affirmation ever will, because most limitations are not enforced by fear. They are enforced by familiarity. You don't resist change because it's dangerous. You resist it because it disrupts your internal language. It forces you to speak differently, to describe yourself, your future, and your capacity in ways that feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity feels unsafe to the nervous system. This is why alignment must be gradual. You don't replace your internal voice overnight. You train it. Just like any discipline, the goal is not to sound powerful. The goal is to sound honest without being limiting. For example, instead of "I am confident," try "I am learning how to stand my ground." Instead of "I am free," try "I am loosening what once controlled me." These phrases don't trigger resistance. They invite participation. They acknowledge reality without surrendering to it. Alignment happens when your words feel reachable. Now let's talk about ritual, not in the mystical sense, but in the psychological one. A ritual is simply an action done with intention and repetition, and language is the most accessible ritual you have. Every morning, before the world speaks to you, you speak to yourself. Most people waste that moment. They immediately rehearse pressure, obligation, or lack. What happens if, just once, you change the opening line? Not to something grand, something precise. A single sentence that sets tone instead of outcome. Today, I move deliberately. Today, I don't rush my thoughts. Today, I choose clarity over noise. Spoken once, slowly, not to convince, but to orient, because orientation determines direction. The same applies to moments of stress. When something goes wrong, your default language appears instantly. This is where alignment is tested. Not when things are calm, but when they're disrupted. Instead of reacting with the usual phrase, pause. Replace it with something stabilizing. Not optimistic, stabilizing. This is uncomfortable, but temporary. I don't need to solve this immediately. I can respond instead of react. These sentences don't deny difficulty. They prevent collapse. Over time, this changes how your system responds to challenge. Not because life becomes easier, but because your internal narrator becomes steadier. And steadiness is power. there is one final element most people overlook: listening. Alignment is not only about what you say, it's about what you consume. Every conversation, every piece of media, every repeated message, all of it feeds your internal language. If you surround yourself with speech that reinforces fear, urgency, and inadequacy, you will internalize it, no matter how aware you are. This is not weakness, it's permeability. The mind absorbs what it hears often enough. So part of authorship is curation, choosing what voices earn repetition in your life, and which ones don't. Because your internal narrator is not created in isolation, it is shaped by environment. When you change what you listen to, what you say begins to change naturally. Now step back and look at the full arc. You're not trapped by fate. You're not trapped by circumstance. You are shaped by the language you live inside. And language can be rewritten, not forcefully, not instantly, but deliberately, one sentence at a time. This is not about control, it's about coherence. When your words, thoughts, and actions tell the same story, movement becomes inevitable. Not because you're pushing, but because you're no longer pulling against yourself. And that is the quiet power most people never learn. Not motivation, not hype, but alignment. So here's the final invitation. For the next 24 hours, listen to yourself. Not to judge, not to fix, just to notice. Notice what you repeat. Notice what drains you. Notice what stabilizes you. And then ask one simple question. If my inner language were writing my future, would I keep this sentence? That question alone changes everything. Write in the comments. What sentence are you ready to stop repeating? And what will replace it?